Hey there, I'm Gilad Barash, and welcome to Who's Your Data, the podcast that deals with how data influences life and how life influences data, the human side of data analytics. Progress in healthcare and medical research requires a lot of data. In the era of big data, health data is among the most valuable and the most private information anyone can have. Two major hurdles with finding quality medical data are access to that data in a private and ethical way, as well as bias on the data due to underrepresentation of women, certain racial or ethnic groups. In this episode, I talked to Dinny O'Brien about how DonateYourData.org and Data Lake are trying to solve this problem with a patient-first approach to sourcing medical data for research. Data Lake is an EU-funded startup creating a global medical data donation system based on blockchain technology with privacy and informed consent as its fundamental pillars. We discussed this data donation framework and how it addresses the issues of privacy, consent, data monetization, and working to minimize biases. Dinny explains how they approach patients to opt in, how they vet organizations that request access to this data, and how they plan to expand throughout Europe and the US. This is a fascinating conversation on a service that could truly disrupt and revolutionize how medical data is collected and used for research purposes. All right, so Dinny, welcome to the Who's Your Data podcast. It's great to have you on as a guest.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your invitation and really looking forward to our discussion.
Yeah, so let's just kick it off. First of all, can you tell me what is the problem that Data Lake and the Donate Your Data Foundation are trying to solve?
Absolutely. So it's a broad topic, but it falls into a few categories. So there's a major issue right now when it comes to medical research, and that is twofold. The first is access to medical data, and the second is bias in medical data. So on the access side of things, in Europe and in other countries as well, including the US, there's been very little framework for accessing patient medical records and other associated data, say in an ethical and private way. And there's always been this discussion between access to data and ethical access to data, patient privacy rights. And until more recently, there's really been no great solution for both sides. So what at least we've done in Europe is we've created some legislations that allow for the ethical access of medical data based on patients' express consent, because we believe in Europe and many other countries do as well, that patients should have a say in whether their data is accessed or not, especially when we're talking about our most private and sensitive data sets, such as our medical records or even our genomic data, or if we're talking about biobanks who are dealing with tissue samples, we're talking about very sensitive medical data sets. So access to data has always been an issue, and it's partially, as I said, a legal issue, but also a technological issue. And then the other side of things is actually, let's say, even more pressing in the sense that we are moving now into an era of big data in medicine, AI algorithms, robotics, all these kinds of incredible technologies, but they're only as good as the data that they're based on. Unfortunately, the situation is that most medical data that is used for studies historically has been of white Western males. And that's no dig at that demographic, because that includes me, but it is a significant problem when we're talking about AI algorithms, for example, that aren't getting the data of women or minorities or ethnic groups. And if that's the case, and there's a saying in programming, which is garbage in, garbage out. And if your AI models or your other technologies are being trained on data that is biased, then the output is going to be biased, and the product, such as the algorithm, is actually going to underserve or misserve the other demographics who have not been representative. So we have a problem of access and we have a problem of bias, and these two things are absolutely crucial to solve in order for us to kind of go to this next level of Star Trek type technology, medical technology, which we have all of the technologies either in place or currently in development, but without the right data and without access to that data, they cannot succeed. So this is why these are huge pressing issues, and those are the two primary issues that we are seeking to solve.
And so what exactly is the core product that Data Lake is offering, and how does it address this problem?
Absolutely. So what we have devised based on this new legislative framework that has come out in Europe and goes into force later this year is actually a technological solution that allow people to verify their identity and then give legal consent to the use of their medical data. So for your listeners, if you consider it such as blood donation, for example, that the Red Cross does, what we're trying to build is actually a technological solution and a large database of people who have given or revoked their consent to the use of their data. And by doing this, not only does it fulfill kind of the legal requirements, but also the ethical requirements of asking people permission for their most sensitive data sets. So at its core, what we have built is a data donation framework, data donation technology, which allows people to verify their identity and then with absolute certainty either give or revoke their consent. And how we're doing that without getting too deep into it is using blockchain technology, which is, for those who aren't aware, kind of an open ledger that allows you to verify that one set of data has been copied exactly without tampering or without changing. Because one of the big issues that we see with a lot of the private data and tech companies is that you have to trust them. And if they say, oh, you just, trust us in our database, we're not using your data, but there's no proof of that. What that actually does is affect adoption. And when you look at the studies on how willing people are to share their data with researchers, depending on the country, it can be as low as 30 to 35% of people being willing to share their data. And trust is a major, major element of that. So by using the technology and building the tool that we have, what we're saying is you don't actually have to trust us. If you have said, I am a donor, or you've revoked, even more importantly, and said, I do not want my medical data to be used for research, you do not have to trust us. You can independently verify that what we say that we're doing is actually reflected in our databases. And so what we've really done is solve the issue of trust, which is the major roadblock to adoption of this technology. So that's kind of the core product. And then from there, we're building actually an enterprise grade account where other companies, research entities who are performing maybe even clinical trials could launch their own instance of this. And basically use the same consent technology that we're using, but within their own ecosystem. Your listeners are probably aware that big pharma does a lot of the research around the world, and they have pros and cons, and it's a large debate. But to be honest with you, what this technology actually allows us to do is create the playing fields operating on transparency and openness. And setting the standard for transparent consent for data use so that there really is no longer any need to trust companies or research entities that they are doing or not doing what you have given or not given permission for them to do.
If I understand correctly, this is an app that a user can go in and say, give consent to donate certain data and then also revoke it. So a couple of questions about that, just around the details. What is the granularity of consent that a user can give? Let's say if I have blood tests, but I also have, medical history around my feet or something, like, what is the granularity of consent that I can give around my medical data?
Absolutely. So what we've tried to build is a flexible system. On, let's say, the broad scale, what we're trying to build is a global medical data donation movement so that people might, like blood donors or other altruistic systems, people can broadly give their consent. So in our current iteration, we have a consent for general medical records. We have a consent for genomic records, for example, and people can say yes or no to either one. Obviously, we require them to give consent to the treatment or the processing of their data because that's the kind of the standard that we need to follow. But beyond that, there's a lot of granularity. And as I mentioned, we have the kind of this enterprise account where an entity can actually put in any kinds of consent they want. And this is actually one big issue another issue, there's plenty in medical data, which your listeners may not be aware of. But one of the big issues that we have as well is that, let's say a patient is participating in clinical trials for new drugs. Over time, it becomes actually quite difficult to maintain contact with them. Partially, that's a limited scope of the provider of the clinical trial. But what, for example, can be used as a broad consent for recontacting after a clinical trial. And what that might actually enable is 1, 5, 10 years down the road, being able to recontact that patient, being able to touch base with them and see if there have been any adverse effects or long-term issues. So it's really quite a flexible system, and it allows you to really put in whatever kind of consent for now related to medical data, but it could, of course, be expanded more broadly. But it really does allow granularity in terms of what consent a patient is able to give. So it's not like you just sign up and all of your data belongs to us. Actually, it is quite granular, and people have to expressly give their permission for a certain action or a certain data type to be accessed.
And then the other side of that is what the data actually gets used for and what types of research. Is there any say in terms of the target of that data and who uses it?
Absolutely. So one really important thing that we've put in place is actually a framework of transparency, but also ensuring that patients have a say in where their data goes. How we're doing that for now is we actually have a coalition of about 40 patient organizations. These are nonprofits, NGOs, and they form our Transparency Council. And the number one question before any data would even be considered to be sent to a research entity is this pro-patient? That is so important to us because we don't want this to just be used, for example, a tobacco company to start developing extra addictive products, or even a healthcare insurance provider who are trying to identify the high cost patients so that they can cut them out of their plan or reduce their medical coverage. So the number one kind of litmus test for whether data could even be sent is going to be, is this pro-patient? Is this for the public good? After that, it has to be legitimate research and development, of course, and it has to, be trying to solve some sort of healthcare issue, find a cure for something. It could be finding better and more effective drugs, safer drugs, all kinds of applications. But the number one question is this pro-patient? Is this going to harm someone? Is it going to reduce their healthcare? Is it going to reduce their insurance coverage? All of these questions are asked by our Transparency Council, and then actually they make the final decision. So our foundation is the legal controller of the data. We have a responsibility to protect it, to ensure it's secure. But at the end of the day, it is this Transparency Council of patient organizations who make the final call on whether they believe this is a pro-patient research or not.
So you would have a hospital or independent researcher or some nonprofit that would come to you and say, we want medical data, and you would decide on who they are, whether or not you want to give them the data.
Exactly. It really comes down to what their goal is, right? What's actually been fantastic is to see how many startups and research entities are actually working on really important cures and treatments and technologies. So one example that I really love to give is a company here in Europe who are creating an open source algorithm for heart attack prediction. So it will actually integrate with either biosensors or wearables, and it will look for markers of an upcoming heart attack. And for anyone who is aware of this, the time of response to a heart attack is absolutely one of the most determining factors of the outcome. This company could, of course, close source this and license out, at great cost their technology to ambulances or hospitals or clinics. But in fact, what they've done is said, we're going to open source this. We believe this is going to save lives. And there are countless more examples that I could give, but that one for me is really kind of one that checks all the boxes. They're working on something really interesting. It's going to help a lot of people. It does involve actually directly interfacing with someone's biometric data, which again, most personal data set. But what they're doing is then open sourcing that and allowing everyone to benefit. And that for us really checks all the boxes. Is this pro-patient? Is this going to help the world? And do they have the interests of the general public in mind? And that's really the goal of our foundation, and also Data Lake as a technological provider, is just to ensure that all of these incredible developments that are happening in the realm of medical technology are ultimately going to benefit and not harm patients.
Just out of curiosity, do you happen to know percentage or ratio of requests that come in that get denied because they don't meet those standards?
To be frank, we haven't had too many. To be honest with you, that was quite a pleasant surprise, in the sense that a lot of the research, even from the kind of big pharma that I know is the boogeyman for a lot of people, but not only are there legal frameworks in place to kind of guarantee this, but generally speaking, the vast majority of the requests that come in really are pro-patient and for the public good. I think there've honestly been maybe one or two in the last year where it either wasn't fully clear on what their end goal was, or it was, as I said, one of these companies or types of companies that we've said we can't work with. But generally speaking, the vast majority, I would say probably like 98% of them are actually pro-patient and looking to help people.
So with the two problems that you talked about that the foundation is trying to solve around access and bias, they're interrelated, because lack of access to medical care, to quality medical care, then causes there to be less data for underserved populations, which then if you are sourcing data without keeping that in mind and being intentional, you probably don't get to that data, and you don't access the more diverse data. And so in keeping that in mind, is there anything that you do in particular in order to ensure that you are getting more diverse patient data and really are filling in those gaps of representation?
Absolutely. So it's maybe two-pronged here. On the one hand, we follow the request in the sense that I'll give you an example. We're working with Novartis, for example, and some other companies, some other large research companies who are doing studies around cancer, for example. And one of them is doing a study for breast cancer. So obviously, the vast majority of people who have breast cancer are women. So already there, just due to the demand from the research entity and the nature of the research, we're able to then target in on, let's say, underrepresented demographic. But let's say more broadly, the way to really solve this that we believe is similar to blood donation. It must become kind of a global social movement or organ donation, where people are aware that it exists and there's broad participation. So, on the one hand, that means building a global system that really is reaching out to as many different countries, as many different demographics as possible. But then also, I can't release details because it's not signed and sealed, but working with certain ethnic groups, for example, or certain researchers who are trying to study certain ethnic groups or certain nationalities who are typically underrepresented, and then not giving them preference, but really seeking after these sorts of projects that are really doing something a little bit different and are trying to build that representation in the data. So obviously, if someone is trying to do pro-patient work, we will work with them without question. But if someone is really trying to bring in an underrepresented demographic, then we kind of listen extra hard and are extra eager to try and make it work.
Can a research facility make a request and say, we want this and this kind of data? Can you try to find that and collect it and find people that are of that representation?
Yeah, absolutely. So how we do that actually is that we have partnerships with hospitals, and currently this is in Poland, which is where both our company and our organization are based, but we'll quickly expand over the next 6 months to a year internationally. And so we actually have agreements with this hospital that upon receipt of consent of this person, we can actually find their data specifically in their data banks, and they'll send it over. So one of the, let's say, best applications of our system is actually targeted patient acquisition for researchers. We're dealing with researchers that are studying the most rare diseases you can imagine, like maybe 20 people in a whole country have certain diseases. And typically this has been very, very hard to be able to find these patients for them to participate in genetic studies or clinical trials and this sort of thing. And so by taking this broad approach and having the agreements with the hospitals in place, it becomes a lot easier to identify the right patient with maybe the right history. And it can be really, when you see the data requests that come in, it starts with, okay, we're looking for people with lung cancer. That's a broad population. We're looking for people who are female with lung cancer, a lot narrower. And then you start to get into like finer demographics and segmentation, and they must have this certain lifestyle, or they must have had it 3 years ago, but not more, and they must have a treatment history of this much. And you really start to narrow it down from potentially millions to maybe a few dozen, a few hundred. And by taking this broad approach and having these partnerships in place with the healthcare facilities that are treating them, we're then able to actually pinpoint them and find those underrepresented and understudied demographics quite well, more easily than in the past. Absolutely.
So you had mentioned that one of the main barriers for people to donate their medical data was trust. And how do you explain to them, or how do you convince them around, by using blockchain technology, you're alleviating some of that, but that's something that's hard to explain to your average hospital patient. So how do you go about explaining to them how this is a different technology that will actually alleviate worry?
Yeah, it's actually not been as tough as we thought, in the sense that what really is necessary here is just public education. First and foremost, this is Who's Your Data podcast, so I'm assuming your listeners are probably aware, on the one hand, people have become more aware of their data and its importance, especially after things like Cambridge Analytica or even the Edward Snowden, leaks
Yeah.
talking about what's actually happening with our data. So that's definitely been a positive, but people don't really understand the importance of their data, even the value of their data. And so for us, we knew when we started this that this was going to be a challenge. And really, the only solution is public education, and this is why we're actually running public campaigns in hospitals, talking with patients, giving them materials that explain, let's say, the more intricate parts or the more difficult to understand parts. We're not giving them a introductory course on blockchain technology, but we do explain the technologies that we're using. And so really public education is the primary key here. And people, they're not stupid. When you sit down with them and you explain the importance of their data, you explain the uses, and you explain, as I said, the technologies that would be adopted or implemented to protect it. We've actually seen, so the original studies that we based our, let's say, aspirations of, there are plenty of studies that look whether people are willing to share their data. Depending on the country, in Europe, it's between 35 and 90%. And it's actually very interesting. It's a reflection often of their trust in their government, in the sense that in the Nordic countries that have a high level of trust in their government and a high level of trust in private industry and their legislation and protections, are in the 90 to 95% range of being willing to donate their data. In Poland, that number was 30 to 35%. So it really does have an impact. There's some socio-cultural, socio-political elements at play here. But what we've actually found is that by going into the hospitals, running public education campaigns, and also by ensuring that there is an NGO nonprofit and a transparency council who are responsible to ensure that this is pro-patient use and that it's being protected, we've actually seen about an 80% success rate with Polish people in hospitals, more than double what was actually predicted in the data. So it's not a magic formula. It's very complex. It's also going to depend person to person. If somebody is more aware of data scandals and privacy issues, they may be more reluctant. But typically, those people are also more aware of the technological possibilities to protect those privacies. So as I said, we've seen some great success just with talking with patients, actually having a physical presence in the hospital, having materials for them to read. That really has been the driving force of alleviating some of that mistrust, some of those issues that we thought we would actually encounter a lot more.
Ballpark figure, do you have an estimate of, how many people to date have opted in?
Ballpark figure, it's hard because we actually have consents coming in every single day through our hospitals. It's in the tens of thousands, from my understanding at present. Currently, though, with our partnerships with hospitals, we have a reach of over 25 million potential patients, which is more than half of the Polish population. And what we've decided, rather, in the short term, is to focus on the most pressing needs for data and go after the targeted people who represent that data. Of course, as I said, if we're going to solve the issues of bias and representation, we need to have a very broad approach. And that's kind of the end goal of this, is to build the global data donation scheme. In the meantime, to ensure the success and proof of concept, as we're still, let's say, in our first year and a half of operations, has been to take a more targeted approach, which, that's why, even though we have half the Polish population represented, we don't have millions of consents, simply because the demand has been for a very specific subset of patients as of right now. But that will certainly grow. And as I said, when we have an 80 to 90% sometimes success rate with bringing patients on board when the time is right, I'm very confident that number will grow, and especially as we move internationally.
Yeah, of course. And I think that you work at think about it, different granularities in parallel, because certainly, I think one of the powerful things about this is that it is, you end up with a global view of many regional data sets that will address the specifics and the specific requirements for every region, right? Poland is going to be different than something in Scandinavia. The details of the studies are different, the requirements are different, but you end up, like you said, as a proof of concept, starting to build from a requirement-based approach. You will end up having enough data that globally will then cover a lot, that you can then reuse. So that makes a lot of sense in terms of the approach. You mentioned that, you're starting in Poland, and can you talk about why, and then where you're planning to go next? Where is this expanding to?
Yeah, absolutely. So the reason we started in Poland, our founders are actually medical doctors, all three of them, and they are Polish medical doctors. And the president of our foundation is very, very respected in Polish healthcare. She's been named one of the top most 100 influential people in Polish healthcare, Forbes nominated. She also is the founder of the AI and Healthcare Coalition, which is kind of doing the same thing, ensuring that AI implementation in healthcare is pro-patient. And they just had an absolutely incredible network in Poland to be able to make this happen because it really does require buy-in from civil society, nonprofit organizations, hospitals, and also the government as well.
Absolutely.
So it really does take a lot of stakeholder negotiations and interfacing and institutional dialogues. And so being Polish doctors and being well respected in Poland as healthcare providers, that made the most sense. In terms of expansion, we have a few different countries that we're looking at, two of them being Italy and Austria, simply because there's a really important element that we haven't quite talked about yet, and that is the monetization of data and what happens there. As of right now, the monetization of data has zero benefits for the patients themselves. People don't get paid for for providing their medical data. It's depending on the country, just collected and traded, let's say, as a commodity. It's almost like a natural resource in some senses. What's different? So, just a quick bit of background. In Europe, we have a new legislation, the Data Governance Act, and unfortunately, they put a phrase in there that said if someone is giving their consent to their medical data to be used, it must be given freely and without reward. So, it's in the legislation that you can't actually pay people to give consent, and the reasons for that, I think, are honorable in the sense that they didn't want people to be taken advantage of and to be paid just small amounts for what amounts to quite a valuable data set. I mean, depending on the data set, we could be talking about your medical data being worth between $100 and $5,000 per instance of use, right? So if it's used 10 times, you could really be talking about 50 grand here. And if there are companies going around saying, hey, I'll give you $50 for your consent to use your medical data, you're losing out by 1,000-fold. So I understand the reasoning for it. However, what it unfortunately does is cut people out of this enormous medical data economy. And in Europe alone, it's 100 billion euros a year. Worldwide, it's close to a trillion, if not over. So it's an absolutely enormous market. And so the reason why we're looking at Italy and Austria as potentially the next countries to expand into is that their courts have actually made a ruling after this legislation came out that said, no, our citizens have a right to monetize their data. So if you have any Italian or Austrian listeners out there, take note, you can actually legally, at some point in the near future, monetize your own data. It could be your marketing data, your wearable data, or your medical data. So this for us is important because, me personally, but also our foundation, we really believe that patients should be full stakeholders in the process, not just consulted, but they should really find tangible benefits, especially when we're talking about these eye-watering sums of money. We really think that people should be able to benefit from that tangibly and financially as well. So this is why we're looking at those countries. We're of course very interested in the U.S. population. It's quite a high demand data set, but it's also important, and there's a large amount of data that could be very useful to researchers doing, as I said, life-saving work. So these are the countries that we're focused on, and yeah, what we hopefully want to do is set the standard and again, proof of concept that you can actually have an ethical and patient benefiting system where they actually can financially benefit too without being taken advantage of. And really, it just comes down to openness and transparency. I mean, if somebody knows that their medical data is worth thousands of dollars, they're not going to sell it for $50, right? So education, again, really comes into play. And so what we would love to do is in these countries that have said, yes, it's legal to do so, we would love to do the full system where based on, let's say, the original transaction for this data, the company or the research entity who is putting the money on the table, so to speak, to make the data flow happen. We want to see that go to not just the hospital who's providing the data, not just an intermediary who's providing access to the data, but also the patients whose data the whole system is built upon. And that's really important for us, and that's why we're looking at those countries specifically for potential expansion.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's true, in all other industries as well, when you're looking at like advertising and, people give away their data and it's fine. If you're not paying for the, for the service, then you are the product, right? So if you're
Exactly.
using it, then they're tracking you, and then you have all of your personal data. You're giving them your personal data, whether it's your financial data, your behavioral data as you're going along, and they
Yep.
make millions and billions of dollars on it, and you see nothing, even though it is your own data. As well as even today, when you're looking at, everybody's talking about the generative AI and the large language models and training ChatGPT, and who benefits from it and who gets compensated for it. Not only do lawsuits out there that are not only from artists and content creators, that the issue is not only that they did not give consent to have their data pulled in as training data, but also the fact that they are not getting compensated for the content that is being used to train. The approach of the individual is the owner of that data, especially when it's medical data. Like, if my condition's special and it's worth a lot of money, then should be compensated.
Absolutely. I fully agree. And, this is quite personal for me in my former life. Let's say I was a published journalist, published photographer, and a writer, and I have a lot of content out there floating around the web. If I were aware, I mean, it's very possible because OpenAI and these other companies are just scooping up absolutely any data that is front facing or public facing on the internet. The ethical approach maybe would have been to track that and ensure royalties go back to the people who are generating this content. And if you think about, let's say, people who have for their whole career published openly text or even images, and this has been their livelihood for decades, they could really be contributing a significant portion of their work, their IP, to these companies who are just then profiting from it. And I don't think that's right, personally. And unfortunately, fortunately, we have the technologies to be able to solve this, such as blockchain is one of them, but there are others that could be used. Unfortunately, they're not being used. And as I'm a little bit of jaded in this sense when it comes to big tech and companies that suck up a lot of data. I wish they would take the ethical and, let's say, more difficult approach, the less profitable approach, but they don't, more often than not. But definitely when we're talking about, LLMs or AI for healthcare, now we're, as I said, getting into these really sensitive data sets, where I think it's not just unethical to be taking this data without permission, but it's unethical to be taking this specific data without permission at all. And I think it's even more so when we're talking about our healthcare data or other, very sensitive data sets. But also, as we said, more broadly, I think when we're talking about LLMs and just sucking up huge amounts of data, there are tools, there are technologies for them to be able to make it an equitable system to ensure royalties go to the people who are building their product with their data. And it's not happening. So that for us, when we're talking about what we're trying to accomplish, which is really saving lives and finding cures for diseases, we knew that the ethical approach was the only way to go, not just from a feel-good moral sense or viewpoint, but also because it's crucial for adoption. And we talked a little bit about trust and these sorts of things. If we want to build a global system of altruistic data being used to save lives, people need to be able to trust it. And so that's why taking the ethical approach is really important for building critical mass.
How do you think about, once you get that data, how do you think about privacy as far as anonymization? What is it that you do? Like you said, you're legally responsible for that data once the patient has consented to giving it to you. How do you think about privacy and before you pass it on to the researchers?
Yeah, it's a really critical topic, and there are some cases where personal data could be important, or let's say personally identifiable data. Let's not just say your name and date of birth, but there's quite a broad range. Sometimes that is useful in the studies that are being performed, and in that case, there's actually a specific permission or a specific consent that would be sought for anything that is personally identifiable. But generally speaking, actually, you don't really need the personal information for the studies. And so, for us, it means spending a lot of time in R&D and man hours or human hours on ensuring that our anonymization techniques are absolutely cutting edge. There's also, kind of this growing field of synthetic data where you take large amounts of real data and you kind of mix and match and change things to the point where you haven't changed the representation of the data, but it's been de-identified in that sense, and kind of mixed around enough that putting it back together is not possible. So that's another very kind of interesting, more new development when it comes to synthetic data that we also are very excited about, because it does solve some of these issues. And then of course cybersecurity is absolutely, crucial for us, and ensuring that there's air gapping and physical keys, and it's not just sitting on a internet connected server somewhere that a talented hacker could get in and cause some serious damage. So a lot of those precautions are absolutely in play, and it really is kind of I don't want to give the exact mix and match that we're doing, because I assume that would opening up to a certain vector, but all that to say, it really does take multiple layers, multiple technologies, and a mix and match of those technologies to ensure that the privacy and the anonymity of someone is absolutely guaranteed. Of course, if we think about quantum computing and some of the developments coming up, it gets a lot more complicated, and we'll respond to that as it kind of enters into the common usage. But as of right now, using just the most cutting edge privacy techniques, cybersecurity, OPSEC, everything to ensure that there's not somebody sitting at the end of a terminal somewhere that can access that data, or de-anonymize it if there was some sort of leak or anything like that. But definitely, if you look at some of the big data centers and how their OPSEC goes, and ensuring that there's air gapping and physical keys and access control, even physical access control to who can actually touch the computer that the data is stored on, or the hard drives, all of these are in place to ensure that privacy and anonymity are absolutely protected.
Out of curiosity, are there research methods that you vet as well? Would you say, you know what, we're not down for like using our data to train LLMs, just because nowadays there's still too much uncertainty with the results and how credible they are and reliable, and do you think about the research methods that are getting used in these proposals?
Not in terms of shutting off any one particular area, because I think I fully understand where your question comes from in terms of, let's say, newer methods or newer technologies, and being unsure of the implications. But I think for us, really, the primary lens is in analyzing whether it's going to be pro-patient. So, for example, I lived in the US. Your listeners can probably hear I have a bit of an American accent. I'm not American, but I lived there for a long time, which means that most of my adult life was actually spent in the American healthcare system. And even though I was employed, had medical insurance, I still, several times in my life, didn't seek medical treatment because of the cost. Because you have a $15,000 deductible, and you just don't have the cash to pay it, right?
Yes,
or an ambulance at $3,000, and you just can't pay for it. So one area which I'm actually personally really excited about is the potential for LLM and AI to actually fill that gap. And if you think about primary care and the first touch of care, let's say you have what feels like a sinus infection, you're not really sure. Maybe it's a cold, maybe it's nasal cancer. You really don't know. Yeah. But you have this kind of light touch or easy to diagnose illness that, based on the symptoms, most junior doctors in their first year could diagnose very, very easily. These are the sorts of candidates for me that really could be filled by LLM and AI. And in a perfect world, I'm sure it won't have it exactly like this, but it has the potential. If we're talking about an open source LLM that is serving as a first touch triage, that is taking in very straightforward symptoms and giving you most likely outputs, you don't actually need to go to a hospital to be diagnosed with a cold. You could very foreseeably in the near future talk to an LLM and AI, and they could be able to diagnose you with a high level of accuracy. As we saw during the pandemic, limitation of physical access to hospitals can and does happen. And therefore, as we talked about previously, there is an issue when it comes to cost, when it comes to seeking care. And when we're talking about very simple to diagnose issues, colds, cuts, bruises, this sorts of thing, we could actually see a future in which LLMs and AI in a free way could actually fulfill and fill these issues. What this means is, instead of people not seeking medical care because they can't afford it, maybe they would be talking to a free or very low cost LLM who's able to diagnose those easy issues. So long story short, this is why I don't think cutting off any specific methodology is the right way to go, because there are applications of LLM and other technologies that absolutely could be pro-patient and give people better access to healthcare.
And these address the concerns that you have, that the foundation has, the access that it gives to healthcare, to at least frontline healthcare in places that are healthcare deserts, whether in the United States or in other countries, is something that is probably going to be revolutionary. So that makes a lot of sense. When we talked, you had mentioned that one of the major initiatives that you're working on is what you called ethical sourcing of data, and that is a big initiative that is happening. Can you talk a little bit more about what that means in the context of medical data?
Even as we touched on before, big tech, private companies don't have a great track record when it comes to ethics. And partially this is just the nature of, in my opinion, capitalism, that when you're driven by profits and ensuring that your shareholders get profits, you tend to make decisions that don't benefit or are not ethical or don't benefit the general public. So for us, we kind of realize that we have, as I said, two ways to go about this. Either we go the Google route and just suck up as much data as possible and sell it to the highest bidder, or we take the ethical route. And as I mentioned previously, that's important for adoption. And what's really actually quite exciting is that if we, and this is our goal, is to set the standard for data access in terms of the rules, who can use it, as I said, making sure that healthcare insurers are not using it to reduce someone's healthcare. By setting these standards, we can actually set the playing rules for healthcare research worldwide. There was a lot of debate in Europe, and it's still kind of ongoing, to be honest with you, whether consent is the efficient way to do it and whether there are situations that are more important than actually seeking consent from patients. So one example is, for example, during a pandemic, and you have tens or hundreds of thousands of people potentially in serious or critical or dying conditions. And therefore, there's this kind of move towards, well, in that case, public health comes over consent. I can understand that. But when we're talking about research without kind of this pressing time crunch, it's not a public emergency. What we're actually trying to do is set the standard and prove that seeking consent can be efficient using technologies. And it is crucial for adoption and, as I've said, building critical mass. So what we're doing and building along with our patient organizations, but also other organizations. So for example, we've partnered with Genomes, who are doing privacy-focused genomic sequencing. So think 23andMe, but without selling your data to private companies. We're trying to build a coalition of organizations and companies that are committed to the ethical treatment of data. So we have a manifesto that we've published, which gives or states that we believe that patients and people have certain rights: the right to decide over their data, the right to revoke the consent to their data, the right to, as we have in European law and they have in California under the CCPA, the right to remove data about yourself from the internet if you desire. And so it's really focused around the individual and citizen rights and ensuring that the systems that we build are compatible and first and foremost, keeping these rights in mind. So that's really for us, kind of the another of the long-term goals is to build these standards for engagement when it comes to data, and doing so with other ethical companies who are willing to commit and sign our manifesto and say, yes, I believe people have the right to privacy, to remove their data, to give or revoke consent. We have a list, I think, of about 10 or 11 different rights that people have. And building a coalition that believe in these principles and commit actually to upholding them.
That is such a refreshing view.
Yeah, medical data is a mess overall, but I've been in the privacy space for a long time, and I remember in the mid 2000s, for example, before Edward Snowden leaks and all this kind of stuff, I was telling people, listen, the government's collecting your data, and it was in the realm of conspiracy theory. People would just kind of brush you off and say, nah, that's nonsense. But over the last 15 years, there's really been a fundamental shift in the public consciousness and awareness of the importance of privacy and data. And some people are just never going to care. And, we can do our best to convince them. But I would absolutely say that we have seen a paradigm shift in people's understanding of data and the importance of it and the importance of privacy. So, it's been a long time coming, but there's a lot of people who have kind of laid this pathway. And I'm actually friends with one of the Cambridge Analytica whistleblowers, for example, and she's done a lot to ensure that this enters into the public consciousness. And so what we're really doing is kind of building off of that and bringing it into medical data, which other than maybe your location data and your biometrics really is your most sensitive data set.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think ultimately the sharing of that private information, I don't think that it is inherently evil in that, from the advertising world, it's this balance of either being very, very private or having convenience, because everything that you do in terms of like, turning on cookies so that you don't have to log in every time you go to a website, or that it remembers your preferences, et cetera. It makes our life much easier, but it comes at a cost that we're sharing data with whoever it is that's collecting it, right? And having the trust that it's not being used for anything evil, I think, goes a long way to making our own lives better, and of course, in this case, helping humanity. So I think that's really wonderful. Now, if somebody's out there listening, one of our listeners all over the world, and they're interested in partnering or learning more about the foundation, what kind of partnerships do you have with people, organizations? What are you looking for, and how can people contact you and work with you?
Absolutely. So our let's say primary public facing tool that we use and our website is donateyourdata.io. And on that website, we have, let's say, three stakeholder groups or three audiences that we're talking to. Number one is the general public, who can sign up as of right now for a waiting list globally to express their interest in donating their data personally. So I'll keep using the analogy of as like being a blood or organ donor, saying I would like to give my data to medical science and to help people. And that's absolutely, as I said, we're in hospitals, we're talking to patients. We really absolutely want to know that people have interest. And of course, we'll use that waiting list. It has a drop down box for which country you live in, which of course we will keep private and not share with anyone, but we're using that to figure out where there is the most demand, so that we can ensure that data donation, medical data donation, goes there in the near future. But we also have pages for either healthcare providers, hospitals, clinics, anyone, biobanks, anyone who has some sort of data that they would like to share, or would like to participate in this program. And it has more information for a healthcare provider who might be interested in joining the network. And imagine it kind of like nodes and just hooking into the network. And of course, then we would seek consent from any of their patients. It's not like they just open up their data banks and start flowing data. It's all based on that consent from the patient. And then finally, we also have in the access to ethical data for their own research, their own pro-patient research purposes. We absolutely would love to talk to them. But honestly, this for us is building a large global social movement, and anyone who has interest in data, even if you're a key opinion leader and you have an audience that you would like to introduce the topic to, we're absolutely interested in talking to anyone who is interested or would like to participate in medical data altruism.
Well, I'm luckily there was this one podcast host that you agreed to talk to as well, because this is a fascinating topic, and I'm very excited about it. So thank you, Denny, for coming on the podcast. Hopefully, we'll have you back again with more news.
Yeah, Gilad, it's been an absolute pleasure. It's a topic I'm very passionate about, but it's something that's really growing and starting to build some awareness, and I appreciate you helping us do that. And I really would encourage your listeners, to take a little bit. Take a look into what we're doing and maybe participate, because at the end of the day, we're talking about a use case where data is saving lives. Like, there are people alive today who can say, thanks to data and thanks to algorithms and thanks to medical robotics, I'm alive today. And we're trying to make sure that more and more people can say that. So it's been a fascinating discussion for me as well, and I really appreciate it. And hopefully we can talk again in the future.
Well, thanks for joining us today and listening to this episode. Please remember to subscribe, rate, and review our podcast. And if you have any questions you'd like addressed, send them to who'syourdatanow@gmail.com. That's who'syourdatanow, all one word, @gmail.com. Thanks, and see you next time on Who's Your Data?